afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us here on Tuesday, the 8th of March, for our last lecture in our lecture series. And it's very appropriate that we end off with someone from Grahamstown, Dr. Rob Gess, and he'll be talking to us today about the unusual coelacanth fossil find. So please welcome him to the stage. Thank you.
Well, I hope everyone enjoys it. The talk's kind of geared to a school audience, but I'm sure most of you have been out of school for a while. I guess that's the problem with being the last lecture. Anyway, so Grahamstown, obviously it's very important that we now have our own coelacanths, because Grahamstown has such a tradition with coelacanths. When I was at primary school, they built this building here, which is now part of Siam, but it was then called the JLB Smith Institute. And we got taken there on little school outings by to meet Margaret Smith, the wife of the late JLB Smith. And she'd tell us all sorts of nice stories. They had fish traps from Angola, and she'd tell us about those, and outriggers from the east coast of Africa. They had a big bale of rubber from a torpedoed ship which had a swordfish saw through it. But the main item for show and tell was this particular fish carcass over here, which was caught in 1952 in the Comores, and she would tell us this entrancing story about it that actually started with this specimen that you have to go to the East London Museum to see, which was caught in 1938. Now, in 1930, briefly to recap what she could tell us, in 1938, on the 21st, Henrik Goosen, he had a fishing trawler, and he was fishing off the Chalumnae River, which is only 100 kilometers away, when he caught that fish. Now, he then went back to harbour in East London, and he was connected to one of the curators from the East London Museum, Courtney Latimer, and she used to go down to the harbour and get odd fish. So before he knocked off for Christmas, he left this fish at the harbour and sent a message to Courtney Latimer that he had left something for her there. And Courtney Latimer went down and found this fish there, and she realised this fish was something very unusual. She'd never seen anything like it before. No sort of guide on fishes could say what this thing was. So she wrote a letter to JLB Smith, who unfortunately at the time was on his Christmas break in Neisner, and apart from trying to have a little bit of a holiday, he was also marking chemistry papers, because he was a chemistry professor who did ichthyology as a bit of a side angle. So he wrote back and said, from that sketch, that sounds awfully important. Please do your best to preserve this fish. The fish was rather big. It didn't fit in the fridge. And then he couldn't work out what it was, so he got a book out on fossil fishes, and he started looking through the book of fossil fishes. And he found that it most resembled this thing, Macropoma, from the Cretaceous of Germany. Now, that seemed very odd, because now Macropoma is a coelacanth, and it belongs to the lobe-finned fishes. Now, most lobe-finned fishes had actually died out by the end of the Devonian, the early Carboniferous, but coelacanths had continued apparently to the Cretaceous. And then they were presumed to have died at the time of the dinosaurs, because no one had seen one younger than 70 million years old. Okay, now I'm sure I'm talking to people who understand what lobe-finned fishes are, but lobe-finned fishes are the other group of bony fishes that are almost extinct now. And other than lungfishes and coelacanths and us, four-legged beasts, there are none of these lobe-finned fishes left, because we are in fact extremely derived lobe-finned fishes. Because the characters that define lobe-finned fishes is that they have a single articulation between their pectoral limbs and their pelvic limbs and the pectoral and pelvic girdles. It always consists of a single bone, followed by two bones, followed by many bones. And that is actually what defines what we call sarcopterygian fishes or lobe-finned fishes. And that lobe tends to be covered in muscles, those bones are covered in muscles, and that's what gives them a distinctive lobe. And sometime in the late Devonian we actually descended from another group of lobe-finned fishes, not from coelacanths, mind you, the Tristocopterids. Anyway, so as this all slowly sunk into JLB Smith in Neisner, he wrote frantic letters to Courtney Latimer saying, preserve everything you can, preserve its innards. But unfortunately, it had all gone rotten, and its innards had become a smelly heap. And so she gave it to the taxidermist to mount. And so by the time he arrived there in, note, mid-February, this was all there was. So he then confirmed that, unbelievably enough, it was a coelacanth. And he went on to publish it in Nature, and he called it Latimeria, chalumnae, Latimeria after Courtney Latimer, and chalumnae after the Chalumna River. And then he went home and did a lot of kicking of himself and a lot of self-justification about his chemistry marking, and decided he had to find another one of these things that he could cut open and have a look at the insides of. But then World War II descended, and you'll see at various points in this talk that historic events have these sort of interesting effects on scientific discovery. Anyway, World War II came along and he couldn't go and look for them. At the end of World War II, though, he started collecting fish up the east coast of Africa, I suspect with a hidden agenda to find more coelacanths. And wherever he went, he put out these wanted posters. And he met this guy, Eric Hunt, seen here on his schooner. Eric Hunt had a schooner that went from the east coast of Africa to the various islands off the east coast, transporting people and goods and things like that. And he gave a whole bunch of reward posters to Eric Hunt. And when Eric Hunt was in the Comores, he put some of them up and he gave them to people. So it was that, by strange coincidence, it was almost Christmas again. It was Christmas Eve, and in 1952, Smith had just got off the Union Castle line in Durban with his latest wife, and he was on holiday, and he got a telegram forwarded from Grahamstown to say, from Eric Hunt saying, I've got one of those fishes. It's in the Comores. Because these two guys here, Ahmadi Abdallah and this other guy, Suha, they were fishermen who had been fishing off an outrigger, and they had caught one of these and brought it to Eric Hunt. And there it was. So Smith was determined not to make the same mistake again. He wasn't going to wait until February to collect this. So he sent desperate telegrams to say, look after this fish, take care of this fish. And in return, he got a telegram from Hunt to say, actually, the French authorities want to impound this fish because they realize it's important. So Smith was determined not to lose this fish. So he used his connections in Parliament to get the Prime Minister, D.F. Malan, to lend him a military Dakota aeroplane. And he flew all the way to the Comores, or he didn't, the pilot flew with him on board, and they went and collected this fish, and they brought it all the way back to Grahamstown. Which now, what Margaret Smith didn't tell us, but which I've realized later, this caused a bit of an international diplomatic furore, because the French weren't happy, and the governor of the island resigned early, and from then on, the French put a ban on people removing any coelacanths from the Comores. But that didn't come into the story, we were told. And Smith went off to, this was the ichthyology department at the time, it's where the geology department is now, and in this little shed here at the back, he then dissected this fish, and it was published, and there was a whole lot more international excitement. And before I carry on with the story, I just want to make a note, though, that in all that excitement, various memes or stories became mainstream, moved into the sort of popular scientific literature, which I'd just like to dispel. One is that Latimeria was a living fossil that had been unchanged for 300 million years. That's actually not true, as we'll see. Secondly, it had a cartilaginous skeleton, and this was seen as a sign that it was primitive. Thirdly, that it was the ancestor of tetrapods. Fourthly, that it walked around on the bottom using its loam fins like legs. And fifthly, that the only coelacanths left lived on the Comore Islands. So none of those are actually 100% true. We now know a lot more about coelacanths. Just to briefly diverge, people have done a huge amount of studies since then, which I'm not going to go into. They've filmed these coelacanths paddling around at deep water. Coelacanths we now know lived at 100 to 250 meters depth, and a lot of the adaptations of them, like the cartilage skeleton, probably relate to their adaptation for living at depth. They don't walk around on the bottom using their legs. And they've now been found to occur in quite a few places up the east coast of Africa, basically wherever the shelf drops off sufficiently that you've got this deep water close to the continental shelf. And in fact, actually quite recently, coelacanths have also been discovered across here in Indonesia, although those are a second species, Latimeria mendoensis, which is brown as opposed to chalumnae, which is blue with white spots. Anyway, so that's just an aside, catch you up. So there, yeah, cartilage skin, not primitive. Walk around, no. No. So we'll catch up on these other two statements by the end of the talk. I myself was very keen on looking for fossils as a youngster, and I was also very inspired by the coelacanth story. I'm sure everyone who listened to Margaret Smith went away with dreams of one day finding ancient, thought to be extinct, long-lost creatures, etc. Anyway, that's me in a lime quarry, just hauling out some fossils as a youngster. And I was very lucky in that I actually had the mentorship of Dr. Norton Heller, who was the sedimentologist, paleontologist at Rhodes Geology department, which was coincidentally built exactly where that ichthyology department that Smith was in was. And every time I went to see Norton, I walked past this plaque at the door with these pictures of coelacanths, just to remind me that I wanted to find my own coelacanths one day. Anyway, as luck would have it, in the 1980s, Grahamstown got a little bit volatile, and this was really good from my point of view. This was fantastic, because this road, the road from Port Elizabeth to East London, used to run through Beaufort Street and then through Raglan Road, but because of the protests in the 1980s, the government decided that they would actually rather build a road around Grahamstown so that the government vehicles wouldn't be subjected to the attention of protesters. And so they cut this thing through. And just near Waterloo Farm here, they exposed all this black shale here. Now, I and various other people were quick to discover that this was actually full of nice fossils. And so as I went on to become an undergraduate and studied geology and zoology at Rhodes, again being lectured by Norton Heller, whenever I had spare time, that's me over there, I went out to look for fossils, and I discovered that there were a lot of fossil fishes in just this little lens up here. Now I want you to notice these layers of sandstone here and above there, and this layer of black shales here. Now, sedimentary analysis by Norton and some of his other students demonstrated that the environment in which those rocks had been laid down was a bit like the Kierboom's today, with the little sandstones there being the sandstones from the Rivermouth Bar, and the black rock having accumulated in these kind of fairly still embayments of the lagoon. Now, when I say that, people often think, oh, so the Cowie was kind of up near Grahamstown then. But it's not really like that, because although the map looks like that, then 360 million years ago, which was when those rocks were deposited, the map looked like this. The South Pole was over here, and there was this little Antarctic Sea here, and a river, not actually the Cowie, emptied into the Antarctic Sea there. So it was quite a high latitude site. Because of all the fossils I'd been finding, in the mid-90s, Norton Heller arranged for me to have some funding to carry out systematic excavations on the site. And we managed to start filling it out a bit. We started putting creatures on that lagoonal landscape. And what we were finding in the mud represented plants that had come in from the land, as well as sea creatures, some of which had come from near the mouth, where it was more marine, and some that had come from sort of more brackwater, freshwater influenced areas at the top. And we started describing these with the assistance of colleagues. We described South Africa's first known woody tree from these sort of frond-like twigs of the tree Archaeopteris, which was one of the first pro-gymnosperms, i.e. pre-conifer trees that spread around the world, and incidentally were probably responsible for the second global extinction event, which came about 1 million years later. Because the first forests had the opposite effect of the greenhouse effect. They downloaded lots of carbon, and there would be a global cooling at about 358 or so million years ago. Anyway, so we described that, and we described two kinds of seaweed from which would have grown probably near the mouth of the system, and we described various charophyte algae. They're the most complete charophyte algae describable. Those are only about 2 centimeters across, by the way, those little whorls. We described 4 species, which actually included, which I haven't illustrated here, another species, Hexacara guineensis, after Grahamstown, which was the first fossil to ever have a Sicosa name. The most common vertebrate remains were these plates and occasionally these whole juveniles of this Grunanaspid placoderm, which we called Grunanaspis guineensis. So it became the first vertebrate fossil to have a Sicosa name. And there were others of these placoderm fishes, Bothrolepis africana. These are strange fishes. They're armor-plated fishes. The whole head and trunk up to the waist is covered in armor plates. They became extinct in that second global extinction event, but their head and trunk kind of articulated on 2 ball and sockets. And these ones, Antiochs, were very strange because instead of fins, they actually had these jointed arms. We also described a shark, which I've recently re-described because the original description was a bit lousy. But it was a shark, and sharks those days, a lot of them had these big spikes on their backs. And that's partially because they were descended from another group of fish, the acanthodians. There were also some faint imprints. I found about a dozen of these faint imprints. They were only a few centimeters long, and these, I was sure, were coelacanths. After some struggles, I managed to persuade a couple of my colleagues they were coelacanths, and I was determined though to find good enough specimens to reconstruct. However, there was a break in the story at this point because Norton Hiller in 1994, he emigrated to New Zealand, and I was unable to get funding to continue with my project. So I went off and did other things, and then in 1999 I was back in Grahamstown visiting my parents, and I opened the Grocot's Mail, and it said because that road cutting was so unstable, the road agency were going to cut it all back and stabilise it. And I thought, but my fossil site. So I went to the road agency and I explained all this, and no one had told them anything about this fossil site. And however, after much negotiation, they agreed to do something about it. So they agreed that although they were going to bench the whole thing, they'd just bench up to the edge of the fossil site. They'd cut a deep bench below the fossil site to catch rocks that fell down. And they provided me with 7 laborers, and we dug out by hand as much of this material as possible. We stacked it there, and then they lent us some trucks, and we hand-loaded these. We put a layer of sand in the back of the truck because we couldn't pile them because they're very crumbly. We put 1 layer of rocks deep, and we trucked them to a plot in Bathurst because we couldn't find anywhere in Grahamstown to store them. And there we stored them in sheds for later use. Incidentally, although jumping forward slightly, in 2007, 2008, they decided to do more roadworks, in which time they actually covered most of this in concrete afterwards, but they did again supply us with trucks and labour, and I again got a whole lot of rock. So that now we have sheds of this rock, which is chunks of this mud from a 360 million year old lagoon. And now rather than sitting out next to the highway, I can sit at a picnic table next to the sheds. That's me just a couple of weeks ago with Tetsuto Miyashito from Alberta University, and we're slowly going through these rocks, finding all sorts of nice things. He said this wouldn't fall off my ear. So what we've been finding is, and I won't go through them all, diverse plants. These are lycopods. These are ancestors of phenophytes. So lots of different plants. And also from the land, we found fragments of scorpion, which are the oldest terrestrial animal remains from Gondwana. And they're from here in Grahamstown. And we found a whole lot of fishes. We found, I found these fossil lamprey. That's the part and counterpart. It's kind of like when you press ink between two pieces of paper, you get two things. They often show slightly different things. You can see the mouth there with the teeth around it, and the gill arches, those are actually the eyes. That little bilobe structure we've subsequently decided is actually the heart, so that's amazing. The fin there. Now lampreys, I'm sure most of you know, but I threw this in for the school children. Lampreys, you still get lampreys today, and they use that sucker disc. They're primitive jawless fish, and they use that sucker disc to drink the blood of other fishes. Anyway, we published Priscomyzon guineensis in Nature, and it went down very well around the world. Then there were also more kinds of armor-plated fishes, some of them with the armor really put up into these spikes, quite unusual. But there are several different ones, but just to move on. Several kinds of acanthodians. This is Diplocanthus acus. Acanthodians are a group of fish that kind of on the tree going towards sharks, but they had fins supported by bony spikes. This specimen is really beautiful. I found it in 1999, actually during the Roadworks, and you can see that in the Albany Museum fossil gallery. There were various other ones, but we'll move on. More sharks, Antarctica ultima. I described this in the same paper where we re-described Plesiosaurus. It had this fairly stubby fin spine. And again, there's this amazing little baby. This is only 2.8 centimeters long. It's a baby example. Because what happened was, when big fish died and they lay on the bottom, they got scavenged and they went rotten, and fish pulled them apart, and you find scatters of elements of big fish. But when you got small enough fish, they got buried quickly enough, you got the whole fish preserved, which is really exciting. There's a little ray-finned fish. 80% of fish today are ray-finned fish, but ray-finned fish in the late Devonian were a really minor piece of fauna. And then we found at least 7 different kinds of lobe-finned fish. Now, I've explained what lobe-finned fishes are, and this is a family tree of the main groups of lobe-finned fishes. Onychodonts are these sort of basal ones. They actually look like a cross between ray-finned fish and lobe-finned fishes. Coelacanths are a basal diversion, and we'll get back to that. The next branch up the tree is lungfishes and porolipiforms that are now extinct. In fact, only coelacanths and lungfishes still exist. Rhizodonts we didn't get, but we do have schistocopterids. And what I haven't published is we do have some sort of evidence that some of these creatures were around as well. Just to address another thing, whether coelacanths are the ancestors of tetrapods, the answer, as I said, is sadly no, because coelacanths are, although they're basal to these lobe-finned fish group, they have a number of really specialized characters. And maybe the most obvious one with regard to this question is that they don't have a maxilla, an upper jaw bone. So they have teeth on other bits of the top of their mouths. And of course we have a maxilla, and all tetrapods have maxillas, so that rules them out. They're a rather specialized side branch, which isn't to say that they're not really interesting examples of basal sarcopterygians, but it does mean they're not actually ancestors of tetrapods. So we can cross off old forelegs being the ancestor of tetrapods. So most of the lobe-finned fish remains we have consist of isolated bones, onychodont jawbone, pellet bone of a lungfish there. various bones of a tristichopterid, and also isolated bones which probably relate to some of these creatures, but we'll have to talk about those another day when I've finished that. And this was a big story in the late Devonian, the move from these creatures to these which are called elpistostegeids, to these which were tetrapods that remained aquatic. But that's a whole nother lecture. What I did find, which was beautifully preserved, not just isolated bones, were a number of coelacanths. You can see this coelacanth here, its eye, its lower jaw. And what I was saying is it's got proper, you can see it's got proper bony vertebrae there. That's the counterpart of it. And that specimen is particularly good for reconstructing the head. That one has a very nice head. I've got about 24 of these baby coelacanths. They're all about 3 to 5 centimeters long. But in describing the new species, I relied mainly on 3, although obviously I consulted with all the others. This one has a very nicely preserved head. You can see the dermal skull here and here in part and counterpart. That's a drawing. And that's a reconstruction of how its head looked. This one here its head's a bit rotten and falling apart, but you can see some detail of its dorsal fins, and its tail fin is absolutely beautifully preserved. I mean, you've got to consider that this tail fin here is about 5 millimeters long. So there's that amount of detail and 5 millimeters long. You can see a little bit of preparation around the edge there. All these specimens are actually prepared under the binocular microscope with the tip of a porcupine quill, which makes an excellent preparation tool. I showed you that picture of Tetsuto from Alberta. He wanted to take some porcupine quills home with him after trying them out, so I gave him some. And then this specimen here has a nice, its head's a bit lousy, its tail's very tatty, but you can actually see the position of these fins on its body, which is very important. So those are the 3 type specimens, the holotype, the 2 paratypes. And they allowed me to do this complete reconstruction, which I named last year in the Zoological Journal of the Linnean Society. It is called Serenicthus cowiensis. So it's actually only there are only 3 other Devonian coelacanths that are reasonably, that you can reconstruct as whole organisms. So that in itself is quite special. Miguasha is one of the Devonian coelacanths, and there is another one from Australia that's closely related to Miguasha. So remember that Miguasha comes from Canada, and you can see it actually doesn't really look how you would, that's Latimeria. So you can see Miguasha, it doesn't really look much like Latimeria. It's got this funny tail. It's beginning to get a bilobed tail, but it's kind of sticking up. It doesn't have a lobe there or there. It's quite a primitive sort of coelacanth. That's Diplosacchides, which is probably one of the closer relatives of Serenicthus, but different in a number of ways. This is actually an early Carboniferous coelacanth, but it's got an ancestor in the Devonian. This is Alanipterus. So this is a sort of leaf-shaped coelacanth. That's Rhabdoderma. It's a Carboniferous coelacanth. And that is Latimeria. So when we look at this also, then we can address that last question of the popular view of Latimeria, is that Latimeria isn't an unchanged living fossil. Because it doesn't look like that or that. Coelacanths in the Devonian were quite diverse. And Latimeria is actually quite evolved. So although it is the last survivor of an otherwise extinct group, it hasn't remained unchanged. It's evolved quite a lot. So we can say that it hasn't been unchanged for 300 million years. Now this is just, we did a phylogenetic analysis, an analysis of the family tree of coelacanths involving all reasonably preserved coelacanths. This figure just shows the ones from the Devonian and the Carboniferous, so only up to about 320 million. That's Alanipterus, that funny leaf-shaped one, which had this rather fragmentary ancestor in the Devonian, Holopterygius. That's that funny one from Canada, And Gavinia actually looks a bit like it. And Diplosarchides is the one that I said was probably the closest to Serenixus. So you can see that actually this is quite an interesting thing, is that by the end of the Devonian, coelacanths were really quite diverse. You had all those different forms of coelacanth. But then there was this extinction event, probably brought on by the first forests, and coelacanths were knocked down essentially to two lineages, Alanipterus, which is that leaf-shaped one, and we only, Holopteris was its ancestor, Alanipterus, we've only got one occurrence of Alanipterus from one locality, and otherwise its line seems to have died out shortly afterwards. And then there was this various radiations of coelacanths since then. And what we found is that Serenixus is the sister group, or close to the common ancestor, of Alanipterus and the other Carboniferous coelacanths. So out of the Devonian coelacanths, it was actually the coelacanth most like coelacanths later on. So there he was. And we ask ourselves, why are they all only 3 to 5 centimeters long? Why are they so little? And there are various clues. We did find bones of them getting a little bit bigger, and the bone ornament was changing. They've got very big eyes. Mineralization was kind of less towards the back of the animal than the front of the animal. And we find a lot of evidence suggest that actually these are all baby coelacanths. So that's a nice picture that Anton Brink painted for me of this tiny little baby coelacanth swimming out of this forest of charophyte algae. You can imagine it in one of those quiet embayments where you still get little fish at the top end of estuaries. There would have been shoals of them. We're not quite sure where the adults came from. They probably came from shallow seawater and came into the estuaries to breed so that their young would be protected from all the sharks and big lobe-finned fishes and creatures. So we can picture them living somewhere around there. Anyway, I think that's all I prepared to tell you. There's obviously more, but that's my talk. So, thank you. Yeah?
So you mostly find the coelacanths in Africa.
Yes, most modern coelacanths today are found on the east coast of Africa. No, most modern coelacanths are found further up, sort of around Madagascar, off Mozambique, and going up. I think the most northerly one is somewhere off northern Kenya. So they're more tropical. So it's a good question, though, because it shows also, I mean, these ones over here, Serenixus, was quite near the South Pole. So it was living in cold water, shallow marine cold water going into estuaries, whilst the modern ones are living in subtropical warm water at depth. So they're occupying an entirely different habitat.
Yes, Rob, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Do we know much about their feeding habits? I mean, was it a fish eat fish, or were they specialized feeders, or what?
They probably ate small fish or small soft invertebrates, something like that. We don't have any stomach evidence. Some of the later coelacanths, sort of Mesozoic coelacanths, they have got fish in their tummies. And I think the modern ones eat a lot of cephalopods and some fish as well, I think. So, yeah, whether this thing was eating maybe lamprey larvae. You know, there were lamprey larvae which were even smaller than these, floating around. They were nice and soft. Maybe the babies could eat those. Curiously, from 300, Rhabdoderma I showed you there, is a carboniferous coelacanth. The next oldest, I mean, this is the oldest coelacanth breeding nursery in the world, at 360. The next oldest one is Rhabdoderma at 300 million years from Mason Creek in North America. And coincidentally, the next oldest fossil lampreys are also from Mason Creek. They must have enjoyed the same sort of environment. So maybe those ones also ate babies, lampreys. Anything else? Yeah.
I can't help but see the similarity. That picture there reminds me a bit of the environment at Swartvlei. The chorophyte beds used to be on the inside of the Potamogeton beds.
Right.
When the Potamogeton beds disappeared, the wave action from the lake actually uprooted the chorophyte beds. So chorophyte beds will only survive in very calm water with no wave action or no river flowing through.
Yeah.
They also require a salinity of below about 15, between near fresh and 15, so they can't survive in full seawater. So it would definitely be an estuarine. And the interesting thing also about Swartvlei is that the central part of the lake, it's a meromictic lake, so it has almost full seawater, or very high salinity water on the bottom. So it's anoxic. Nothing goes in there. So if a fish dies in the center of the lake and falls into this black mud, it's black mud exactly the same as your black shales. But the littoral area where the chorophytes are is white. The sand is oxygenated. It's marine sand. So it's exactly like the white shales that you had at your site. And it seems to me that that's the sort of environment that you've described here in Grahamstown. Yeah. And it's reflected in today's world. And what also amazes me is how the chorophytes, that picture there of the fossil reconstruction of the fossil chorophytes, are almost exactly the same as the living chorophytes today. Yeah. So they might have changed also a little bit like the coelacanths, but they've also come through virtually unchanged over hundreds of millions of years. Yeah. Which is quite amazing, you know, on the one hand a fish and then the other hand a plant. Yeah. Whereas most of your other invertebrates, many of the plants, trees and everything have all disappeared. They've become totally extinct. There's nothing resembling them today. Yeah.
No, it's interesting. There are some things that are real survivors. Scorpions. The basic kind of shark. I mean, there are a lot of differences, but really, if you look at a shark, you can say that thing's a shark. You know? So they've stayed. Lampreys are amongst the things that have stayed. And lycopods. In fact, actually, if you go out along the bypass there, the cutting before you get to the fossils on the left, if you climb up, you'll find lycopodium growing on the black shale. So lycopods, although they're much smaller nowadays, they're just little, whilst they used to get quite big, they're still around. In fact, interesting, the oldest surviving thing, which we probably had at the site, but we haven't got definite evidence of yet, are songololas. Songololas are found all the way back in the Silurian in Scotland. The oldest definitely terrestrial animal found in the world is a section of songololo from the Silurian of Scotland, which is so well preserved. You can see the little spiracles, so there's no doubt it's terrestrial. So it's interesting, as you say, some things change a lot, some things are entirely new innovations, but some things are very familiar, and they're somehow very successful and carry on. Yeah?
Sorry, the armour-plated version, is that protection against being preyed on?
Probably. Armour-plated fish are the earliest jawed fishes, and they're partially descended actually from cephalaspids, which were jawless fishes, which were also armour-plated. So we can only assume that it was originally protection against large invertebrates. And we know that in the early days there were some very large invertebrates in the sea. So I would imagine the armour plating was largely protection, but also a lot of the muscle attachment was onto the inside of the armour plating. They had very weakly developed internal skeletons. So partially for muscle attachment, movement, and partially protection. Yeah?
The lampreys were obviously here, but they're no longer in South Africa.
Yeah.
But they're still surviving in Australia. Yeah. Do you have any idea why they disappeared from South Africa?
Yes, now the interesting thing is that the only continent in the world that doesn't have lampreys is Africa. And the reason is because lampreys like cold water. Africa's drifted a little bit too equatorial for lampreys. I mean, you could say the west coast is cold, but it's cold today. But we know from the west coast fossil park that 20 million years ago, it was quite subtropical. So the warm water has probably kept the lampreys from continuing to be in Africa. And evidence for that might be not only that they're kind of in the northern sort of cold water region and the southern cold water region, but actually the taxonomy of lampreys in the southern region is entirely a separate branch from the taxonomy of lampreys in the northern region, which means that for a very long time, maybe since the Cretaceous even, lampreys haven't actually managed to cross the equatorial waters. We'd need a real cold snap, I think, for them to kind of get across. Yeah?
And see how you can tell that the fossils you found with the coelacanths were babies, because when you go back, the guy was sending posters like for like £100 for like a fully living, full-grown coelacanths. When the guys caught it, you could see that it was so big that it could basically swallow the guy's hands.
Yeah, the modern coelacanths are actually extraordinarily large. In the Devonian, I don't think any coelacanths really got bigger than about this big, about 30 centimeters. So coelacanths didn't used to be such giants. So modern coelacanths are quite exceptional. And modern coelacanths, I think, are probably the biggest coelacanths known. Yeah, no. That'd be quite scary. In fact, the guy who caught the first one, he started looking at his teeth and took a snap. He reported that, but he was a bit worried that it might take a piece off him.
Like how long were the teeth? How sharp were they?
Quite reasonable. But they've got funny teeth. They've got very short dentary. It's just the front of the jaw. They've got a sort of short dentary. And they've got a premaxilla, which is the front of the mouth. They've got sharp teeth in the front of the mouth. Further back, because they've lost their maxilla, they actually have little dermal denticles all over the inside of their mouth so that they can crunch things up. But they've got nice sharp teeth in the front.
So they're 30 centimeters long. Today's coelacanths are 30 centimeters long.
No. Ancient adult coelacanths are about 30 centimeters long. Today's coelacanths are a couple of meters long.
30 centimeters long is as long as a T-Rex.
Okay. Good. Chris?
Rob, you've got a lot of rocks still in your shed. What other things are you hoping that you might bring up?
Oh, what we can hope for. Well, I hinted at the fact that I think we've got some isolated bones that suggest we may have clues to early tetrapods. So we need to find more remains of those. I haven't published those yet, but that'll be something big. In fact, most parts of the world where they have tetrapod fossils, they only have fossils of bones. So we're the only place in the world where there appear to be tetrapod fossils and we have soft tissue preservation. So if we could find another whole baby tetrapod, that would be nice. And the other thing is insects. Because insects, at the beginning of the Devonian, say 420 million years ago, they're these from Rinny in Wales. You find small wingless insects. And then at about 300 million years, like 120 million years later, we in North America, Amazon Creek again, you get remains of diverse winged insects. You get those griffin flies that look like dragonflies that suck plant sap. You've got cockroaches. You've got this huge diversity of insects. And there's really nothing in between for 120 million years. But we've got plant fossils. We've got fine-grained soft tissue preservation. We've got scorpion fragments. And scorpions we know are predators, so they must have been eating something. So another really big thing we might hope for would be to actually find some of, well, to find the first, earliest winged insects. That would be a good one.
On a lighter note, are they an oily fish and are they good to eat?
Modern coelacanths. I mean, these ones, I have no idea. The oil's gone out of them long ago. In fact, these rocks are actually metamorphic
I'm
rocks.
talking about the verticals, modern coelacanths.
The modern coelacanths, I believe, are very oily, and they have a reputation for actually being quite disgusting.